Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this first issue briefing of day 2, the annual meeting of the Global Future Councils 2018. Thanks for joining us here in the room. Thanks for watching us live online. 2 years ago at this very meeting, we had an issue briefing on the US presidential election. I think it's fair to say there were quite a few surprised people in the room. There was quite a lot of searching going on, a lot of lack of direction, lots of predictions about where the future was going and what the future held. 2 years on, we're seeing a little bit more clarity, potentially, as to the direction of America and its place in the world. It seems a fitting juncture to revisit the format and bring one of our high-energy issue briefing sessions to this subject again. Those of you who are not familiar, these are 30 minutes. We try to keep them as interactive as possible. So I very much encourage questions at any stage. Stick your arms up. I very much encourage disagreement and healthy, energetic debate. My name is Oliver Cann. I work for the World Economic Forum. I'm joined by Celeste Wallander, President and CEO of the US-Russia Foundation, a grant-making, non-governmental foundation with a mission to support the Russian private sector and US-Russian people-to-people relations. And Tim Dixon, co-founder of More in Common from the United Kingdom. It's an initiative set up in 2017 to help strengthen communities. Tim has recently published a book, Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscape. So you see we have a foreign policy expert here, and we have somebody who can hopefully talk directly to the societal division, which of course we've seen in the USA in recent years, but hopefully you'll have expertise and interests across the spectrum. I think we're all quasi-experts on American political life at the moment, given the amount of news cycles that we're consuming. So I'm going to, as I say, encourage as many questions as possible, but first of all, I'm going to start with one to you, Celeste, which is really about trying to gauge America's place in the world and whether we're any closer now, 2 years in, to knowing what to expect and what America is, given the international order that we live in today.
Thanks very much, Oliver, for inviting me. Thank you for including me in this discussion. The bottom line, and I know this isn't going to come as welcome news, is I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to get more confusing. It's going to get more publicly tense as a result of the midterm elections, in part, but also as a result of the midterm elections in anticipation of the 2020 elections. The bottom line is the change in the American political system of the Democrats taking control of the House of Representatives doesn't have a direct, immediate implication for foreign policy. It can have some side effects in the sense that the House of Representatives is where budget bills must be initiated, so there could be some funding shifts, which can affect, obviously, the implementation and prioritization of American foreign policy. There will be an effect in the ability of the Democratic Party now to hold hearings, investigations on a host of issues, mostly domestic, but also issues of the Russian interference in the election and questions that at least many Democrats have about the Trump business conglomerates, business interests in the international community and whether that affects foreign policy. So you could see indirect effects and constraints and a highlighting of certain issues. But I think the most important effect remains still a little murky, which is will the Republican Party, the sort of old core Republican Party, not the Trump reimagined Republican Party, step back away from the America First, trade-focused, tariff-raising kind of foreign policy that has been launched by the Trump White House, and want to take a step back more towards a more traditional Republican domestic policy and therefore foreign policy? And will that affect the balance of rhetoric within and policy within the Trump administration? I don't think we know yet. I think the best bet is that it won't. The president, you have to remember, is quite powerful in the American political system in foreign policy. And while checks and balances can shape what the president can do and sometimes shapes the political terrain that the president will respond to, so far what we've seen of the Trump administration is not that kind of cautious navigating of a political terrain, but instead marching out on its own and seeing if it works. It's worked so far. It may not work going forward, but the fact that it it may not work going forward, I don't think is necessarily going to cause a course correction in the Trump White House. So it remains unknown, of course, as politics and a democracy always does, but I think you're probably going to see a lot more of the same, and maybe even a sharpening of the rhetoric from the Trump White House.
I suppose one corollary of the election is the fact that the House is now under control of the Democrats. Traditionally, that would mean that the ability for the administration to pursue an aggressive domestic agenda is possibly curtailed. So could we therefore see greater emphasis on foreign policy, the need to build a legacy as we look towards the second half of we're in the second half of the term and looking to build towards an election in 2020? Is that going to contribute to a shift of greater emphasis towards foreign relations as opposed to the domestic side of policy?
Well, you'll certainly one of the incentives of not being able to move forward on domestic programs will be to heighten the rhetoric that, at least again in the Trump White House's view, apparently won them the election in 2016. It didn't do quite as much for them in these midterms in 2018, which is the heightened rhetoric about anti-immigration, which is not solely a domestic issue. It also has implications for foreign policy, heightening the sort of blaming of Europe, the blaming of China and other countries for American problems in order to rally, this term now we use constantly in American politics, rally the base. So I do think you could see a heightened rhetoric. I'm not sure that you'll see a lot of proactive foreign policy, though, behind the rhetoric, because a lot of that policy is complicated and not only controlled by the White House. But the rhetoric, certainly, and the ability more to break things than to create new things, I think is something that should be anticipated. It was easy to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It was easy to not go forward with TPP. It's easy to complain at NATO about the 2% objective of military spending on GDP. But it's harder than to craft a new a positive policy going forward.
So is there anything else left to break?
There's a lot that could be broken. I mean, unfortunately,
what's top of the list,
that's the good news and the bad news. The good news is there's a lot left of the global liberal order that helps to create stability, predictability, a rules-based order that allows us to negotiate all kinds of agreements. The bad news is there's lots that still could be broken. I mean, every time there's an international trip or a summit, everyone's wondering whether we're still going to have a NATO or American membership in NATO, or now we have a set of Asian summits coming up. So I wouldn't necessarily feel reassured that enough dishes have been broken.
Maybe a question more important for the people from this region. What are the priorities likely to be? We've got Iran, of course, we have Korea, we have Russia, all big agenda-topping areas of policy over the past couple of years. But are we going to see a sharpening of focus into narrowing down where we see more continued action?
Let me answer the easy one first, because it's where my own expertise lies, but it's also the easy one to answer. On Russia, I don't think you're going to see a change in policy because the White House will continue to be constrained in implementing the president's preference for a close embrace of Vladimir Putin because of the domestic political terrain in the United States. And it'll probably be heightened because of the House now shifting to Democratic control. On Iran and North Korea, I think those are going to remain high-profile security issues. I mean, there's the whole trade agenda, there's immigration, there's counterterrorism, but on the security agenda, those two are the ones that are not terribly contested in the United States. Not that everyone at all supported withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, and not everyone likes the saber rattling and the rhetoric surrounding North Korea. But there is a consensus, I think, a genuine consensus in the United States that both North Korea's nuclear weapons program and the potential for an Iranian nuclear program are significant threats to not only American national security, but to global non-proliferation structures and therefore global interests. So that one's going to be a priority. The discomfort with the how and the rhetoric, I think, will continue, but that's not going to change those issues from being a priority.
Thanks. I'm going to do a tactical switch of microphones. So could we move the microphones one stage along? I don't know why we have two, but we have two. Tim, tell us a bit about your book, first of all, because it's only been out about a month. It's around the hidden tribes of America. It's about where is the middle, and where are the extremes, and where do they begin, and where do they end? Last week's election would suggest to me that there's not a huge amount of difference in the level of polarization we're seeing in American society.
Yeah, if anything, I think the division is deepening, and the election result shows that with in a sense, the red states becoming redder. Red states not now electing Democrats as their senators, the blue states becoming bluer, and definitely a shift of the suburbs towards the Democrats. But the overall picture is a profound division and polarisation. But the others, and with good evidence of that, we just took our study is a big study. It's 8,000 people across the country. It's a representative sample. It brings in a lot of social psychology into it. So it's looking at sort of underlying causes of polarisation. But we also did a lot of one-to-one conversations, and what came out of that, which I think is missed in the to and fro of the politics, is just how strongly Americans are feeling that division themselves. So we went back to this group a couple of weeks ago, and 87%, so 9 out of 10 Americans say the country's more divided than at any point in their lifetime. And yet, at the same time, 3/4 of Americans say our differences aren't so great that we can't come together. So it's this interesting combination of actually Americans aren't so pessimistic about their own ability to come together despite their differences, but the politics isn't working.
So there's a desire, but there's no means to actually achieve that desire to build more consensus and break a negative vicious cycle that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and because the forces that are dividing and that are driving the polarisation are quite strong. I mean, at a superficial level, you could say that's, it's the media environment, and that's true, definitely. The business models of the sort of attention economy that drive mainstream media they drive up conflict. Social media plays on the sort of vulnerabilities of human psychology, and it brings the extremes into the mainstream, elevates the sort of the difference. And as our study shows, only 14% of the country is the sort of deeply engaged partisan tribal warriors, but they're defining the debate, they're defining the identities of the two sides. So, I mean, I think those pieces of the media environment are important in driving the division. But beyond that, there's what we find in terms of understanding more the psychology of how the United States in particular is showing this polarisation, is that there's this tremendous sense of anxiety in the public, a sense of kind of loss, fear. It's about economic conditions and a long period of stagnant incomes. But it's also about anxiety about the loss of American identity, the pace of change that's taking place, the anxiety about security, anxiety about the jobs of the kids in the future, and just quite differences in values among Americans. So there are some really fundamental drivers behind that are being exacerbated by the media environment.
So a general sense of helplessness, it seems, and that was something which was talked about. So we'll come to you very, very closely. I just want to follow up briefly upon that point, because our theme for the annual meeting, which we're here to discuss and to hopefully build and prepare for, is about globalization 4.0, and it's about the fact that if there is a new round of global integration, it's got to be done right. And the last round has left too many winners and too few winners and too many losers. But really, is that the simple answer? Is it the politicians? Is it the politicians preying on the divisions that are already there, or is it globalization? What came first?
Well, I mean, there is the factors that are driving division in the United States are not limited to the United States. So, we've been doing studies in 5 European countries. I would say 2/3 of the drivers of division are really common across certainly most Western countries, and also are being witnessed. I mean, look at the election result in Brazil recently, for example. Look at a country like the Philippines. Look at Turkey. Look at Hungary. Look at Poland. Like there are similar drivers, and a sort of an us against them narrative is sort of becoming more common in the sort of the populist politics in many places. It's not just being driven by economic conditions, they're a part of it, and just economic growth is not going to be the solution. There are more fundamental forces that are fracturing our societies, that are fragmenting us from the neighbourhood level right up to our kind of national media. And I think that is a common challenge for all of us. And I think in the US context, The gap that we see when we're talking one-on-one with people is that they don't feel anybody's trying to pull the country together towards the common good. They feel like both from the left and the right, there are these the sort of narratives that are actually more about a tribal interest as opposed to a collective interest. Now, it makes me conclude that there is a space there to bring people together, that there is this, we call them the exhausted majority, 2/3 of Americans, who would be responsive to appeal that is more based on unity and commonality rather than on emphasising these tribal differences.
So the Democrats missed a trick by not being able to tap into this constituency better than they did.
Well, but I'd say that, you know, some of the more successful candidates who outperformed actually were tapping more into that message. I mean, if you take a lot of attention was paid to Beto O'Rourke's campaign in Texas, which was really extraordinary in terms of outperformance. He came within 2 or 3 points of winning the state of Texas. No Democrat has won a statewide race in Texas for 26 years. So I think that there are other examples similarly. I think that there is scope there. Maybe that's the playbook for the 2020 campaign.
Great. Well, it's a suitable juncture to see who's got questions to ask. And we'll try to do 1 or 2 at a time. Can we get the microphone over, please? We'll do this gentleman here. Could you remind us your name and where you're from, please, before you ask your question?
Hi, I'm Henry Cao. I'm from New York City. So what do you think of the demographics, like 20 years from now? Because there will be, people say, according to some research, that the Latinos, African Americans, and the other minorities will overtake white Americans become the majority, and this polarization also reflects this anxiety among this Christian white. That's why you see the uneducated white tend to, like 80% will support Donald Trump, while Latinos or African American, they much less support to Donald Trump. It's a huge division there. So what do you think of that, of the demographics?
Demographic change 2 years from now. Okay.
I want to follow on from that. My name's Georgia Francis King. I'm the Ideas Editor at Quartz, and I wanted to talk about the age. So I feel right now, I live in America. I clearly, from my accent, I'm not American. And talking to other millennials my age, a lot of people have seen from the 2016 election that the result didn't turn out the way that they were hoping for. And a lot of millennials have this idea of like, they're told that they're going to be the next generation and they're going to follow through, but they've gone, well, I voted once and it didn't work, so I don't want to participate in this system. And I'm watching this distaste for the way that the system is run affecting a whole generation below who just want to choose to not be a part of that. And so I wanted to kind of like get your opinions on how can we engage that younger demographic and move it towards a more positive and agency-based future.
Have we lost a generation? Great. Can you pass the microphone along, please? We've got 2 more here we'd like to get across. Sir, excuse me. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Frank Cann from Arab News. I wanted to ask about what is really the central relationship in the region between the US and Saudi Arabia under Trump and with Mohammed bin Salman. This has become especially close, but things have changed both with the election and with events elsewhere. And I just wonder how you see this ongoing now.
And last question, sir.
Hi, I'm Ravi Velur from the Straits Times, Singapore. This week we have Mike Pence in town in Singapore, and so is Li Keqiang. As you know, Pence delivered that major speech at the Hudson Institute that sort of laid out the ground for the US-China relationship. And he's going to make another big speech later this week in Port Moresby on the sidelines of the APEC. Can we expect, what do you see as the trajectory of US-China ties? Is it, how worrisome is it? And should we be worried? And is there any chance that between now and 2020, there could be some tweaking of that attitude that could make us breathe a little easier in Asia? Thank you.
Some very rich foreign and domestic questions there. Maybe we should start with the domestic ones. So maybe a couple of minutes per question if we can. Demographics, 2 years from now, and what about the millennials?
So our study is interesting on the demographics piece because essentially we conclude that too much of the way in which we look at politics, especially in the United States, is around demographics. So we've done a segmentation of the country on the basis of answering about 50 questions about values. So they're an unusual range of things. So people's sense of identity, who do they belong to, their views on parenting children. So what's more important in raising kids? Is it their independence, or is it the sort of learning to respect authority? Questions of in your life outcomes, is it more about driven by your personal effort, or is it by sort of social factors, what class you're born into or race or whatever. Anyway, a range of 50 questions. Now we find 7 tribes, as we call them, in the United States, and then we go back and look at their perspective on all these current issues, and the pattern, the clarity of where you see question after question, exactly the same pattern in people's responses. That is to say that people don't really, they're coming out of a values framework when they think about these issues. Now what's interesting is that where you are in those 7 groups, your sort of identity, your values, much more strongly predict your position on all of the current political debates than demography, than the visible traits of racial background, gender, etc. Because it's easy for polling, we often think purely in terms of these groups, but in fact what we find is racial groups cut across every single one of those 7 categories. So this idea that there's a sort of, inevitable demographic trajectory towards a democratic majority, I just think it's not true, because you'll find very conservative young people, very conservative women, you'll find, very progressive, older people, for example, and there's absolutely no consistent pattern where you can say people of particular groups are always going to be in one camp or another. So I think that we have to think about the values differences, and what is the problem now is the way in which we are no longer navigating the differences that people have in values successfully when we have been able to in the past. On the point of age, and the different age is also, obviously, it's a demographic that's important. And it's not to say, I'm not saying that demographics don't count. It's more that the more profound fracture is actually around values. And I think this question of doing politics differently is really important to actually sustaining the engagement of people who are more on the fringe of the political process. The current way in which politics is played out in the United States and the debates are played out is really alienating the majority of people, because they feel so, as we call them, the exhausted majority, they feel it's distasteful. Politics is ugly, it's awful. It's not the way that they relate to people in their own lives, and they wonder why it's necessary for people to take such trenchant positions, such uncompromising positions. And in that sense, Washington DC represents something quite different from their own lives, but they're also anxious that they see that kind of polarisation that we're seeing in social media increasingly invading their own personal space, invading their family life, invading their local communities, their workplaces. And that's something which really alarms them, because they hate the idea that this sort of trenchant division is actually going to split the country apart. Right now it hasn't, but it is happening. And the polarisation is a social cycle, and that's particularly what I think we need to be concerned about. Not just in the United States as well. I think that's something that we're dealing with globally.
All right, so U.S.-Saudi relations. I think that this is one of the cases that I was sort of referring to that could be shaken by the Democratic control of the Congress and the potential for hearings and investigations. Fair or not, there is a sense, especially in Washington, of it's a little odd why the Trump White House is so committed to not just a relationship with Saudi Arabia, because actually American-Saudi relations being strong is a longstanding reality, but the commitment to this particular leadership in the face of all kinds of really disturbing trends in the broader foreign policy elite's views. The Saudi operations in Yemen, which is, I wouldn't say it's constantly in the headlines, but it's perennially in the headlines and pops up in the headlines, and the humanitarian crisis that is so sharp. And now, of course, this assassination and the story behind the assassination. And so I think that whenever, like in the Russia relationship of the Trump White House, whenever it seems a little odd and contrary to sort of broader American values and interests, there's always this kind of what's really going on here. And I think the investigations are going to be aimed at trying to figure out what's really going on here. And fair or not, the wonder is whether there is some kind of set of business relationships or personal relationships underlying what otherwise seems a foreign policy that's just it's just off. in terms of American interests and commitment to regional stability, to human rights, to America's role and responsibility in the international community. So I think that the Saudi relationship is one that is going to get bound up with hearings in the House of Representatives on Trump relationships and policies abroad. The U.S.-China trajectory is a little different. Well, it's actually a lot different, which is that there's been a long-standing debate in the United States, and it was both within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. It was sort of a bipartisan debate about is the best way to manage China's rise through, sort of integration, rules-based order, trying to create a stake for the Chinese elite and Chinese society in the rules-based order. And the Obama administration policy was once again sort of the bipartisan view of let's try the integrative, welcoming approach, while being wary about Chinese power and willingness to break the rules. Towards the end of the Obama administration, I think that was shifting away towards frustration and concern about Chinese military, not just Chinese military power and the growth of Chinese economic power, but the willingness of the elite to begin to kind of push back against the rules of the international order, a little more subtly than Russia does, but nonetheless doing it. So I think there was already a consensus moving towards a tougher policy on China. It didn't necessarily embrace, and it didn't embrace the tariff raising part of it. So now there isn't going to be a strong consensus against a tough articulation of U.S. policy towards China. There's still discomfort with the trade elements, but the security elements, I think, are not just a feature of this White House and actually do underlie a shift in the strategy. That, again, the rhetoric may be stronger, the trade piece of it may be stronger, but I do think that there's a foreign policy consensus elite that, not to give up on the integration, but that probably it's not working the way the United States would like.
Essentially what you just said is that regardless of whether they get a trade agreement, the strategic rivalry will sharpen.
I think that it won't go away. And sharpening may be a variant of political rhetoric and the style of leadership, but it is a fundamental reality, I think, of American policy.
Well, we've got you here, Celeste, because you are a Russia expert, and at the risk of going over by 1 or 2 minutes, where does Russia fit into the relationship between China and America? Of course, there are willingness to strengthen ties between Russia and China as well, but there's also a willingness between America and Russia to strengthen ties.
Yeah, so this is the, prevent a Russia-China strategic partnership question. And is that sort of affecting American foreign policy? There are those who make that argument in Europe as well as in the United States, that somehow, the real risk is a Chinese-Russian balancing against the United States. And to some extent, there's something to that, in that the Russian leadership has pursued a strategic partnership with China, partly because of the lack of options, not just with the United States, but the difficult relations of Russia with Europe and the balance. I mean, China has now outplaced Europe as Russia's major trade partner, for example, in the last couple of years. So that is a reality of that shift, but I don't know that that is a motivating factor in American policy towards Russia, because some of that shift is again, it's sort of objective and structural. The sort of the complementarity of the Chinese economy and the Russian economy is a reality. It's not actually to Russia's advantage because it is very unbalanced economic relationship where Russia's providing a lot of raw materials and low-end products, and China's really reaping the benefits of that kind of trade relationship. But it is a shift in reality where I think that it gets limited, though, and people tend to overlook, because the Russians don't talk about it a lot publicly, but they do talk about it privately, is concern about Chinese moves on the One Belt, One Road throughout Eurasia, and how the Chinese initiatives in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, extending all the way to Europe, are actually at risk of cutting out American commerce, American political relationships, and Chinese influence is going to cut out Russian influence, Russian relationships, Russian business much more significantly in Eurasia than it pushes out the United States, which isn't so much in that part of Eurasia. So even though that's not a loud element of Russian public statements, there is a quiet concern that I think limits that strategic partnership ultimately.
Fascinating. These sessions really do end too fast, but we do have to end. It's a busy day and you have sessions to go to. Tim, Celeste, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us here in the room. Thank you for watching us live online.